Hello and welcome to the Debating Toastcast, a podcast about all things debating, from the Debate Toastmasters Club, 104 London Debaters. Hi and welcome to the Debating Toastcast with your host, me, William Hagerup, one of the debate coaches at 104 London Debaters, a Toastmasters debating club in London. Now, this episode is the third in a series of relatively short podcast episodes on the topic of rhetoric, based on a workshop we did in the club called Rhetoric, the building blocks of persuasion. And in this episode, we are going to focus on something rather important, namely the audience, the people you need to convince. The first thing to have in mind when you are preparing for a debate or a speech or a written proposal or whatever it might be where you are trying to persuade someone else about something is to avoid one of the most common mistakes people make in any communication, really, and that's focusing merely on what you need to say. In persuasion, it's not about what you need to say. It is about what they need to hear. So it's not about what you need to say. It's about what they need to hear. I forgot this myself in a recent debate that I was in. It was about wokeness, and I was so keen on including all the points that I thought were so important and that I had researched and done a lot of work, and I thought they were very clever points. And I just had to say that I needed to say them. I've got all these wonderful points. I must say them all. What I forgot to ask myself was whether this was really what the audience needed to hear in order to vote for my side of the argument. Well, it wasn't, and so they didn't, at least not enough of them to win the debate. Sometimes when we prepare for debate, we get stressed out thinking, oh, we have to respond to all the points the other side makes. But again, you don't. Ask yourself, what do the audience need to hear to support my side? What do they need to hear? So they don't necessarily need to hear all the points rebutted. I'll give you another example. We had a debate some time back about banning TikTok. This house would ban TikTok. But the opposition was able to point out that many of the arguments made by the proposition were not actually specifically about TikTok, but against sort of all social media. The arguments would be true about all social media. And therefore, if you agreed with those arguments, well, then you had to ban all social media. And that was something the audience were not prepared to go along with. And so therefore, the opposition didn't have to rebut all the points the proposition made, because they were able, with that point, to say to the audience what the audience needed to hear. Now, one difficulty with communication, which we will come back to under pathos, is that when you say, for example, car, easy enough word, isn't it? Yeah, but hey, you'll be thinking of one type of car, and the audience members, well, they may be thinking of all sorts of different cars. Perhaps a Mercedes, perhaps a Jaguar, or perhaps a Ford Fiesta, who knows? And they will also have different emotional reactions to this word. And this is called connotation. So where denotation is the word that means the sort of dictionary definition of a word. So you look up car in the dictionary, and whatever is described there, the actual meaning of the word, that's a denotation. But connotation means all the associations you get to the car, including, a positive feeling if you like cars, or a negative feelings perhaps if you don't. And that's why the choice of words is so important. But as I say, we will return to that in a separate episode. For this episode, it's enough to remember that what you mean to say and what they actually hear may be very different indeed. So far, I've said it's all about what they need to hear, but what exactly they hear, or rather how they respond emotionally, intellectually to that, is something you can't fully control. So that's just important to keep in mind. And that's also why, before you can craft a good argument or speech, you do need to be aware whom it is you are trying to convince, right? You will need a completely different register if you are speaking to a room full of, say, religious people, as opposed to a meeting in the new atheist society, if such a one exists. Now, you've all heard, I'm sure, the advice, know your audience. Well, I'm afraid this is probably one of the most useless advices ever given, because either you do know your audience. Say if you're a salesman targeting a particular type of customer, you know that's the target group, and you will know something about it already. Or if you don't know your audience, well, then how are you going to find out about it? Are you going to interview them in advance? Find out what makes them tick? No, I mean, unless you are a salesperson targeting some particular group, in which case it may be worth doing that bit of research. Then how are you going to find out about a room, say, of 50 to 100 people, all from different backgrounds? You can't interview them on their way in, tick off a box or a form, with various boxes as to what's important to them. So it's really, unless you're speaking to a specific group, I mean, perhaps if you're invited to talk to, say, the accountants union, if such a thing exists, then of course, okay, that they will all be accountants, and so there will be a common frame of reference for all accountants, things like that. So there are things like that which you can sort of know to some degree, but essentially you don't really know. You don't know the individuals. They're all different. They all have different backgrounds, and therefore a more sort of useful approach, rather than saying know your audience, a more useful approach suggested by Professor Michael Drout, that's Drout, in his lecture series, A Way with Words on Audible, very much recommend that series, is to first assume your audience and then create your audience. I'll say that again. First, you assume your audience and then you create your audience. Now, assuming something about your audience may not actually be all that difficult. I was on the proposition team recently for a debate on the motion this House believes Brexit is a success. And when we prepared our argument, I tell you, we certainly agreed to assume something about our audience, because this is a London-based club. So most people are, Londoners, they are urban people. And we know that London was very much a Remain voting area. And so it's likely that most of the audience will be of the Remain perspective rather than the Leave perspective. And that's why, as a team, we try to avoid making any points that would sort of unnecessarily antagonize those Remain voters. It's easy to assume that everyone agrees with you, or that most of the audience agrees with you. You make some snide comments, say, about Trump or Boris Johnson. This is sort of the often standard people to make fun of, often in urban environments. But in London, perhaps you are likely to get a favorable response to that. But listen, there are people who like Trump. There are people who like Johnson very much. And of course, it works the other way around, making fun of Jeremy Corbyn or Keir Starmer or whatever. You may get a titter of laughter from doing that sort of thing, but you will also alienate some people, perhaps the people whose vote you need to win. And therefore, what did you gain from that? Probably nothing at all. Not everybody will share your prejudices and your perspective. And so just be careful. Do not antagonize people unnecessarily. Now, of course, in making any argument, and especially if it's a contentious or controversial issue, you will by necessity antagonize some people. You can't help that. Otherwise, your argument will be pretty bland. But what I'm talking about is don't alienate them unnecessarily. Okay? Unnecessarily. That's the key word. All right. Now let's go on to the more difficult part. So you remember I said assume your audience first, okay, and then create your audience. So how on earth do you do that? Well, I don't know if you heard the previous episode, which was on the empathy meme. In there, we looked at a recent article in The Spectator by the former Supreme Court Judge Jonathan Sumption, where he argues for Britain's withdrawal from the European Court of Human Rights. So let's take another look at that article. And I shall quote from the opening paragraph where he says, "The debate about the European Convention on Human Rights is in danger of being diverted into irrelevant byways. Hostility to the convention has become a trademark of the right wing of the Conservative Party, which invites unnecessary partisanship. This is unfortunate, because the United Kingdom's adherence to the convention raises a major constitutional issue, which ought to concern people all across the political spectrum." Now, in this opening paragraph, he first acknowledges that the people most associated with this policy at the moment is people on the right wing of the Conservative Party. But then he goes on to say that this ought to concern people all across the political spectrum. Here, Sumption is creating an audience of reasonable people all across the political spectrum whom he is going to address about this very important issue that they ought to care about, as he puts it. In other words, he's saying, you don't need to be a right-wing conservative to be my audience. He's creating an audience of reasonable people, which may, of course, include people on the right of the Conservative Party, but that will also include people who are not, but who care about an important constitutional issue. And who doesn't do that? How can you not care about that? So let's now look more specifically at how to create the audience in one of our debates here at one of four London debaters, or in a similar sort of debate setting. How do we do it in practice? Okay, so the first thing, as I said, is to make some assumptions. So you assume your audience and then you create it. So let's make some assumptions about our club, one of four London debaters. So I would say in our club, so we're London-based, and London is more left-wing than right-wing. So we'll have both left-wing and right-wing people, but probably more left-wing people. So keep that in mind. There will be some who are non-political as well, of course. And then we'll have some religious people, but probably more that are not. There will be some who are dedicated atheists, perhaps many agnostics who are, not sure about things. Okay. For sure, they will be urban people, and therefore probably very socially liberal, or fairly socially liberal. Even conservative people in London tend to be fairly socially liberal. They will be professional people. They will be fairly well educated, or at least reasonably well informed, and importantly, they will not all be British. Now, the importance of this last point is that we get a lot of people who didn't grow up in this country coming to our meetings. And that matters for what references you employ in your speech. I am myself from Norway, but I've lived here for a long time and I've studied English history and culture. And so I grasp a lot of the idioms and expressions. But let's say you employ in your speech the expression 1066 and all that. Not everybody will know that is sort of a reference to all about English history, stemming from the invasion by the Normans in the year 1066. And so, having made all these assumptions, you go to work on creating your audience. So the way you do that is to make sure that you use phrases that as many people as possible in your audience can identify with. So say, for example, you open your speech with saying, whether you are to the right or to the left, you can agree with whatever point I'm making, that homelessness is a bad thing or whatever it might be. Whether you believe in God or not, religious freedom is important. You don't need to be a farmer or live in a rural community to care about the plight of farmers. You say that and everybody will probably agree with you. No, that's true. Farmers are important, even though we live in cities. We care about the farmers. All reasonable people must surely agree that, whatever. And I'm sure we all agree about the importance of education, immediately. Oh, yeah, that's something I care about. People will think that, and then they'll be taken into your embrace, and they are more open to your argument because now they feel they are part of your audience. You have included them in your audience. One of our debate coaches, Lo Luong Lo, by the way, who also did an excellent workshop on fallacy some time back, and we had a talk, which is one of the podcast episodes, so you can look that up. The talk on fallacies, and there's also some excellent articles on the club blog, disagreeing agreeably. So do please look that up. But Lo had an excellent debate speech where she argued for the beneficial effect of Netflix, I think it was, and you know what she said? That she started by saying, "We all remember lockdown and how these streaming services were helpful and useful, blah, blah, blah." And of course, immediately we felt, oh yeah, we remember that, and so we were part of her audience. She created an audience by that very phrase, okay? So, in other words, you start by assuming certain things about your audience, and then you use phrases that will help to put them into a receptive frame of mind that will include them in your audience. The key thing, and I return to this, is not to say things that will unnecessarily antagonize your audience. Unnecessarily antagonize your audience. That's so unnecessary, literally. So, for example, don't use labels. Don't start saying, "Oh, that's racist," or "You're being ignorant," or "That's naive," or "That's Islamophobic." These labels, they just antagonize those who feel you are aiming for them, and also it's not helpful for anybody. It doesn't really enlighten anyone. Instead, well, you know how diversity and inclusion has become a bit of a mantra these days, almost a bit of a meaningless cliche at points. But hey, there is a real meaning behind that expression. And you know what you want to do in debates is to create some genuine inclusion out of all the diversity. You want people, whatever their backgrounds and whatever their original opinions, to be able to agree with the particular point you are putting forward in the debate. Another example, back in, I think 2022 it was, we had a debate in the club about, the Roe versus Wade being overturned in the US Supreme Court. Now, I was on the proposition team, and we were very, very careful to say that, look, you do not need to be against abortion to agree with us that this was a legally correct ruling, because that was what the debate was about in the way that we framed it. So instead of antagonizing those who were in favor of abortion, and again, we can safely assume our audience in London, in England, will mostly, for the most part, majority will be in favor of legal access to abortion. And so what we did was to create an audience of people where they were included in the audience. We said, look, you don't need to be against abortion to just agree with the argument that the ruling was legally correct. And we made other points as well. I should hasten to add, so that was the only point. But that was one way of sort of including those who felt that they sort of disagreed with the result of that ruling in America, but that they could still agree that actually it was legally correct to do it, and then to be able to consider all our other arguments as well, because now they were included in our audience. So then, in conclusion, try to forget the advice knowing your audience, because either you know it, which is great and helpful, or you don't, in which case it's pretty much impossible to find out what makes your audience tick. Instead, make some reasonable assumptions about your audience, and on that basis, go on to create your audience. That is, use wording that will bring people into your warm embrace. Inclusion out of diversity. And don't alienate them unnecessarily by the wrong use of language. Finally, remember, it's not about what you need to say, it's about what they need to hear. Focus on that, and your chances of being persuasive will increase greatly. Thank you for listening.
You've been listening to The Debating Toastcast. Feel free to leave a comment, critical or encouraging. We welcome both. And if you'd like more information about joining the club or coming first as a guest, please have a look at our website, 104londondebaters.club, or send us an email on info@104londondebaters.club. That's info@104londondebaters.club. Thank you for listening.